When we study the Korean War, the focus often falls on troop movements, casualty reports, and geopolitical consequences. Yet, hidden beneath these narratives are countless smaller decisions, choices about shelter, materials, and survival that shape the course of engagements and the endurance of soldiers in ways rarely discussed. One of the most overlooked aspects was the use of treated timber and wood surfaces, preserved with techniques that made them, pretty much impervious to water. Structures built decades earlier, often in remote villages or military outposts, withstood torrential rains and harsh winters not through modern technology, but through traditional methods that Western observers largely ignored at the time. Before we explore the full story, subscribe to Thermal Vault to follow a channel dedicated to uncovering the overlooked strategies, materials, and innovations that quietly influenced warfare and survival. The importance of this treated timber was not aesthetic. It was functional, strategic, and, in many cases, a matter of life and death. The Korean peninsula's climate, particularly during the monsoon season, was, unforgiving. Wooden structures that were not properly treated decayed rapidly, often collapsing under the weight of snow or, just plain old rot. Commanders soon realized that occupying forces, whether United Nations troops, North Koreans, or Chinese volunteers, needed shelter that would remain viable over extended campaigns. The surviving structures and bridges often employed a form of surface treatment derived from centuries-old Korean techniques using plant oils, lacquers, or combinations of resin and ash that rendered wood almost impervious to water. These techniques were rarely documented in Western reports, yet they had a profound influence on operational planning and troop endurance. When we examine why certain buildings and timber lasted while others failed, the explanation lies in both material science and strategic foresight. The treatment methods were labor-intensive and required foresight, but the Koreans had perfected these techniques long before the 20th century. Timber treated in this way could survive prolonged exposure to the elements with minimal maintenance. For soldiers moving through the countryside, this meant that a roofed building, a bridge, or even a stockpile of planks could remain usable long after surrounding structures had rotted away. Commanders who understood this subtlety could rely on these preserved resources to maintain supply lines and troop shelters, while those unaware faced logistical complications that slowed operations and increased exposure to environmental hazards. The decision to incorporate treated timber into military operations was also, a reflection of survival strategy. Units operating in the mountainous terrain of Korea often faced freezing winters and, torrential rains during the monsoon. Fires for warmth were essential, but damp or rotted wood would not burn effectively, forcing soldiers to travel further and expend more energy-gathering fuel. Treated timber, however, could withstand the weather and provide both structural integrity and combustible material when necessary. By leaving these treated materials in place and timing their use carefully, military planners ensured that soldiers had access to reliable shelter and fuel without compromising their mobility. The result was a subtle but critical enhancement to human endurance under extreme conditions. So, understanding the tactical implications requires looking at the interface between human decision-making and environmental management. The ability to identify, preserve, and deploy treated timber, it actually became an unspoken skill among experienced officers. clearing structures prematurely or, attempting to harvest untreated wood in wet conditions often produced unintended consequences, delays, exposure, and material loss. By contrast, a restrained approach that accounted for natural durability allowed forces to exploit resources efficiently. This lesson extends beyond military applications. The underlying principle, conserving valuable materials until they can be used most effectively, is a cornerstone of survival strategy and logistical planning, relevant even outside the context of war. There is also a geopolitical layer to consider. Korean traditional timber treatment, reflected centuries of knowledge that Western forces initially undervalued. This knowledge gap sometimes, influenced the outcomes of minor skirmishes and logistical campaigns. Armies that understood local building techniques gained unintentional advantages, reliable shelters, protected storage for food and munitions, and durable bridges that allowed troops and supplies to move despite weather challenges. In effect, centuries-old craftsmanship became a tactical asset, quietly shaping operational outcomes. The interaction between local civilians and occupying forces further complicated the picture. Civilians often retained expertise in treating timber and maintaining structures. Commanders who respected this knowledge could secure local cooperation, preserving materials and structures for shared benefit. Conversely, mismanagement or disregard for these practices frequently led to premature destruction, forcing troops to improvise under harsher conditions. The consequences were both immediate and long-term, affecting not only military efficiency but also post-war recovery, as preserved structures became the backbone of rebuilding efforts. From a survivalist perspective, the lessons are clear. Water-resistant timber allowed for shelter construction, fuel stockpiling, and bridge maintenance under extreme conditions. Timing was as important as technique. Using these resources too early or without planning could create shortages later, while judicious deployment supported sustained operations and human endurance. This interplay between material preparation and strategic patience is one of the more enduring lessons of the Korean War, illustrating the subtle but decisive factors that can shape both military and civilian outcomes. The ecological dimension cannot be ignored. Properly treated timber by resisting decay and water infiltration contributed to landscape stability, reducing erosion in areas affected by rain and snow. Roads, embankments, and defensive positions that relied on this timber remained operational, indirectly supporting supply chains and troop movements. In a theatre where environmental conditions often dictated the pace and safety of operations, these overlooked materials were a critical yet understated component of logistical planning. Looking back, the so-called forgotten wood surface treatment really shows us that warfare is not just a contest of weapons. It's, also about foresight, a deep understanding of materials, and the ability to adapt to the environment. Remembering these details matters because, it reminds us that history is rarely just a sequence of battles. It is a network of decisions, some visible, some hidden, where, honestly, even seemingly mundane materials can influence outcomes and shape human experience. Treated timber was not glamorous, but it was indispensable, a quiet force supporting life and operations under conditions where, failure could be catastrophic. If this exploration of resourcefulness, foresight, and historical nuance resonates, go ahead and subscribe to Thermal Vault. Sharing this video helps bring attention to the subtleties of history that are, all too often, ignored, but remain essential for understanding both the past and its lessons for the present.